father was born in Bordeaux, France, and came over here when he was 10 or 11 years old in the late 1800s. My mother, Beatrice Desfarges, was also very French, but she was born here. I was born in New Orleans and grew up in the mid-city area, really a block from Bayou St. John. So I went to Holy Rosary Grammar School. And then after that, I went to Jesuit High School for 4 years. And from Jesuit High School, came to Loyola Business School for 4 years. After I finished business school, most of the people in my class were in the ROTC. We were activated, and I spent 2 years in Germany. And then I came home, didn't know what to do. In fact, many of my classmates were in the same boat. We didn't know what we were going to do. So for some reason, we said, well, hell, let's go to law school. We had friends who were in law school who were doing all right. We said, if they can make it, we can make it. So we decided to go to law school. When I finished law school, I went up to work in New York City with Standard Oil New Jersey, which is now ExxonMobil. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't that challenging because they had how do I put this? They had a process where they really took the young lawyers along very, very slowly. And because this was the headquarters of Standard Oil, it was basically just a holding company. They owned all these operating companies. And so I wasn't that satisfied, and always knew I wanted to teach, going all the way back to grammar school. By pure chance, and I guess God's will, I get a call one day from Dean Henry Engler, who was dean of the business school at Loyola. He said, I'm in New York, I'm downstairs in the RCA building, coffee shop, and our office was in the RCA building. I said, okay, Henry, I'll come down and talk to you. So we talked. He said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I don't know. He didn't know I had this decision. And he said, well, guess what? He said, Professor Michael, who teaches taxation at the law school, and this is around April, is leaving in May to go back home to Chicago. His parents are not doing well. I said, and I was in the tax department. I practiced tax law with Standard Oil. So I picked up the phone the next day, called Brendan Brown. And I said, Dr. Brown, I understand that you have a blah, blah, blah. And he said, yes, we do. Yes, we do. I said, well, I'm very interested. The next day I get a call from him, you've got the job. I taught tax for the first 3 years because after 3 years I went to Yale for my master's degree. When I came back to Loyola, I volunteered to teach labor law because the best professor I ever had in law school was my labor law professor at Yale. And I learned a really good technique of teaching from him, I thought. And so I tried to emulate him. And I felt it would probably be most appropriate if I was trying to do that to teach labor law. That's an interesting story. Dean Papali was going to, because he had gotten up in age, he was going to resign from the position. And we established the university established a search committee. And we went through the usual process of having interviews at the annual meeting of the AALS, the Association of American Law Schools. And we only had one candidate that applied. And the committee was very, I guess, fairly stated, unimpressed with him. So when we got back to New Orleans, Leon Sarpy called me, and I assume he called Dennis, and said, you two have to be off the committee because we're going to consider you all for the position. And they ended up recommending me to the president. So that's how I got it. The year I was appointed dean designate because Dean Papali still had 1 year remaining on his agreement. So he was dean, I was dean designate, and I would succeed him at the end of that academic year. I had not had a sabbatical during the time that I was dean, except for that 1 6 or 8 month period when I served pro tem on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. But other than that, I had not had a sabbatical. So university and I agreed in 1980 that I would take a year's leave as a sabbatical. And I did, and then that year Dean McCauley was appointed acting dean. And during that 1 year sabbatical, I went downtown with what ended up being Gardnerata, but it wasn't Gardnerata when I first went downtown. And then after a year there, I had to make a decision because they offered me a partnership to stay. And I made the decision to stay, which I don't regret at all. I really enjoyed my time with that law firm. My strength was as a classroom teacher as opposed to a practicing lawyer. No question in my mind. That I enjoyed it, but I never felt, I don't want to say comfortable, I never felt confident as I did when I go in a classroom. I had a quadruple bypass in 1989. That really set me back. But I got to the point that I said, no, I think it's time. I've tried this. It's been a wonderful ride. It's just a great group of people I was with. But I think I'm ready to go back, because I kept teaching as an adjunct while I was downtown. I didn't teach every year, but I taught most of those years. And so I decided, well, I'm going to go back. And there was a need for a visitor in around 1992. Professor Keith Vedder was on leave. So it gave me an opportunity to come back for a year. And that's the year, as I mentioned earlier, that I started teaching constitutional law when I was a visitor. It just so happened that year, one of the full-time faculty members who was from the East decided to go back home. So there was an opening on the faculty. And so I had to make a decision what I was going to do, and I decided I would apply for it. So I applied for the full-time tenured position again. And I guess I called in a few chips, and I got the position. So I was able to come back. I'm pretty sure I was given tenure and a full professorship when I came back. So I came back. And I was, I guess, in the second year being back. Louis Westerfield, who was the dean, in late May of a year, decided to take the position as the dean at Ole Miss Law School. And so, for some reason or other, I was asked to step in as interim dean while they searched for a dean. And the first year search did not go well at all. So I didn't have to, I was asked to stay as another year as dean, which I did. So I was interim dean for 2 years, 92, I think, to 94. And then back on a full-time faculty. And I stayed on the full-time faculty until I retired in 2002. Of course, it's been dramatic change, dramatic. When I got into legal education, the theory was that the law schools had a student for 3 years, and the responsibility was to teach them certain, I don't want to say skills, because that word was not used in those days, but certain abilities to think like, quote, think like a lawyer. So there was a lot of emphasis on case analysis, and writing, research, things of that nature. There was no issue with respect to, what should I say, clinical type of issues. The closest we came to anything like that was moot court, where you had an opportunity to, get involved in the appellate process. But in terms of trial work, there was nothing available. About 2 years after I became dean is when the clinical program started to develop. And Professor Keith Vedder came to me one day and he said, I think we should get into this clinical type of education. Now, clinical education is not cheap, so the Ford Foundation was giving law school seed money to begin a clinic. So we applied. I'm sure Keith must have written the application, but I, helped him somehow. I signed it at least, and Ford Foundation came down, interviewed us, and established a grant for us to begin the clinic. So we started the clinic, I think around 74, something like that, 1974. And we were very fortunate in the sense of how were we going to choose a person to run this clinic. Buddy Lemon was on the faculty at the time, full-time faculty, and he came to me and said, Dean, I'd like to head the clinic. And that was great because one of the big issues in legal education in those days was what is the status of the head of the clinic? Because typically they were recruiting practicing lawyers who would come in to head up the clinic, and faculties are very jealous about their position. So these practicing lawyers were typically in those days not given a faculty status like a tenure track position. So we avoided that dilemma because Buddy was already a tenured faculty member, so that worked out perfectly. And of course, he was a terrific lawyer, as we know. So he headed up that clinic. So that was the big change. So we started a clinic. We had a limited number of people, I think 15 or 20. And Buddy ran it very successfully. Now, one of the big issues with respect to our clinic was getting the Supreme Court to approve a rule to allow students to practice under the supervision of a lawyer. And we had a lot of opposition to that. But thankfully, the Supreme Court voted to amend the rule of practice and allowed students to practice. So we were the first clinic in the state by far, and maybe in the South. We were on the ground floor. Today's challenges to the profession certainly deal with the inability of many people, particularly in the middle class, unable to afford a lawyer, to say nothing of the people in the lower economic class who can't afford lawyers. Now, first of all, legal education is part of the profession. That's one of the arms of the profession. What can legal education do to help the profession in that regard? That's a question that I don't think anybody's addressed yet. To me, right now, the profession has to figure out what it can do to meet this crisis. And I'll leave that to the professionals in the profession to figure that out. I don't know what the answer would be. I can't imagine the answer from a legal education perspective is let's just keep turning out more and more and more lawyers, because that's what we've been doing, and that has not impacted this problem at all. So there's got to be a new paradigm, it seems to me, that the profession's got to develop, and it's going to take a while to think this through, I'm sure, to address that problem. One of the things that I'm doing in retirement is trying to stay healthy, number one. But I do enjoy playing golf. My goal is to shoot my age. And with every year, it gets easier.